It didn't happen all at once. It never does. Betrayal begins with silence, a missed glance, a half-lie, a breath too shallow, and by the time you feel the fracture, it's already split you wide open. There was a time I would have trusted her with my last breath. Julia had that effect on people, disarming, gracious, a kind of soft focus that made reality blur around her. She was warm in public, meticulous in private. A woman with answers, poise, presence. I used to call her my anchor. And for years, she was exactly that. We met in law school. She'd forgotten her laptop charger in the library and asked if she could use mine. Her tone was confident but not entitled, and when she smiled, some part of me exhaled. We married 5 years later, not a lavish wedding, just close friends, family, and an autumn dusk folding itself around a white chapel. I was never the jealous type. I thought that meant strength, trust. It does, I suppose, until it doesn't. It started predictably with little things. She began working later, not unusual. Julia had just made partner at a mid-size firm and late nights were part of the package. I supported her proudly, made dinner most nights, left lights on when I went to bed. But over time there were moments, small pauses where things used to flow. She stopped humming when she brushed her teeth, stopped asking how I slept. And once I noticed she'd returned a book to the shelf in the wrong section, a novel wedged among the biographies. Julia never misfiled a thing. Her world was constructed of order, then there were the absences. "I've got a client dinner," she'd say, eyes flitting past mine. Or, "I promised Sasha I'd help with her deposition notes." Sasha, the elusive, overworked paralegal I'd never met. When I asked about her, Julia would wave the question off as though I were being nosy, paranoid. The worst part wasn't the lying, not yet. It was the erosion of small intimacies, shared glances, the casual touch of her hand on my arm, the way we used to pass notes during slow Sunday breakfasts. All of that faded like steam on a mirror. Still, I tried to believe her. Belief is cheaper than confrontation. Easier too. Then came the trip, a weekend conference in Seattle. She packed light, too light. The kind of light that doesn't match 3 days of seminars. A silk camisole tucked between suit trousers. Perfume she hadn't worn in months. I said nothing, just kissed her goodbye and watched her Uber disappear into the fog of morning. That night I couldn't sleep. By the time I searched our shared financials, I was already sweating, not out of fear but shame for not doing this sooner. I had access to everything, an accountant's curse, and I traced a series of withdrawals to a boutique hotel, not in Seattle, closer, much closer. The next morning I drove past it. Her car was parked outside. I didn't stop, didn't knock, didn't confront. Instead, I turned around and drove home, my hands trembling against the steering wheel. Some part of me still hoped for an explanation, that she was helping a friend, that it wasn't what I thought. But as I pulled into our driveway, the hope began to rot. I spent the afternoon walking through the house we built together. Our living room still smelled faintly of her lotion. The half-finished laundry reminded me she'd worn her white cashmere sweater 3 days ago, the one she only pulled out for special occasions. Not work trips, not client dinners. I stood there for a long time looking at it and finally said the words aloud, "She's having an affair." The silence that followed wasn't loud. It was clean, cold, like a room scrubbed of air. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there and felt the weight of clarity settle into my bones like an old injury. I sat at the kitchen table for hours, barely moving, the hum of the fridge keeping time. That night I didn't sleep. I listened instead to the silence of a life quietly splitting open, not with explosions but with dust and absence, and the way a woman stops humming when she brushes her teeth. The next few days passed like fog moving through glass, slow, soft, and strangely frictionless. I went to work, answered emails, sat through meetings where people discussed revenue projections and fiscal cliffs as though the ground beneath my own life hadn't already collapsed. I nodded when I was supposed to, laughed when someone made a joke. I was efficient, professional, even personable, but something in me had gone quiet, not broken, not yet, just silent. I started watching Julia the way you study an unfamiliar animal, curious, cautious, detached. I paid attention to the little inconsistencies that used to slide by unnoticed. Her smiles came a beat too late. Her phone was always on silent, always face down. Once when I reached across the table to refill her wine glass, she flinched, not dramatically, just enough for my hand to pause in the air. She didn't notice, or pretended not to. That weekend, I waited until she left for her Sunday strategy meeting and then opened her laptop. It wasn't locked. Of course it was. That was her genius. Julia never looked guilty because she never acted guilty. Her lies were wrapped in the mundane, her email was clean, her call history was benign, but her cloud storage told a different story. A folder tucked deep inside a subdirectory labeled CLE Notes held two files. One was a PDF of case law, the other was a spreadsheet. It was blank at first glance. But when I dragged the cursor down, the columns unfurled like a secret blooming in slow motion. Dates. Names, transfers, offshore accounts. And beneath it all, my signature, forged. It wasn't just an affair, it was theft. Julia had been siphoning money from a dormant investment account I'd forgotten we even had, something we'd opened during our second year of marriage to invest in a friend's startup that never took off. We left the account untouched after that. Until now, she hadn't taken everything, just enough, slowly, precisely. The withdrawals were spaced out in intervals just long enough to avoid triggering alerts. But they were all in the same pattern, moved from the joint account, filtered through her firm's internal expense shell, and then out to a private equity firm I'd never heard of in her name. And mine. I stared at the spreadsheet for a long time. It wasn't the betrayal that shocked me, not anymore. It was the calculation, the absolute surgical precision of it. She had planned this, not overnight. Not in the wake of some midlife emotional spiral. This had been meticulous. I could see it in the timestamps. She started moving funds 4 months ago, almost to the day right after I got promoted. When I thought things were finally stable, when I thought we were happy, and still I didn't confront her, not then. I copied everything to an encrypted drive, closed her laptop, sat in the kitchen and made coffee. When she came home that evening wearing a black coat I didn't recognize and smelling like hotel soap, I asked if she wanted Thai or Italian for dinner. She smiled and said, "Surprise me." God, she was good. That night I lay beside her in bed, pretending to sleep, listening to the soft rhythm of her breath. I turned my back to her not out of anger but to stop myself from looking. From trying to find the woman I married in the outline of her silhouette because she wasn't there. She had been replaced. Not by the man she was seeing. Not even by the woman siphoning our finances, but by someone who had made peace with becoming a stranger. And in that moment I realized something important. I didn't need revenge, I needed clarity, I needed freedom. But first I needed proof, something that wouldn't just validate what I knew but expose the full shape of the deception. Julia had made a mistake by dragging me into this on paper. My name on the transfers made her clever, yes. But it also made her vulnerable, because it meant I wasn't just the betrayed husband. I was the other half of a crime, and if I played this right, I wouldn't have to destroy her. She'd unravel herself. All I had to do was wait and watch. There's a particular clarity that arrives once the heart breaks clean. No more questions, no more hopping. She'll explain herself over coffee, admit some moment of weakness that we could dress up as temporary. What remained now wasn't grief. It was the precision of glass, sharp, silent, and reflective. I began to live in the space between pretenses. Julia and I still had dinners together, still exchanged pleasantries. She'd ask about my day, I'd tell her something harmless. She'd kiss my cheek in the hallway, I'd smile like it meant something. But beneath it all, I was already gone. The man sitting at the table each night was a placeholder. The real me had stepped outside the story, watching it like a slow-burning film I already knew the ending to. My instincts told me this was bigger than an affair and deeper than some financial betrayal. There was intent in her silences, strategy in her softness, and something about it all felt orchestrated. I began tracing the shape of a longer game, so I followed the money. I took time off work under the pretense of stress leave. Just need a breather, I told my boss. You know how it is. He nodded solemnly, probably assuming something was off at home. He wasn't wrong. During those days, I mapped out the transfers. I pulled bank statements, traced connections, and discovered a second account one I hadn't known existed under a shell company Julia had quietly set up 18 months earlier. The name was innocuous, Kestrel Partners, but the pattern was obvious. She positioned the company as a legal consultancy. On paper, it looked clean, just a holding space. But the deposits into it matched withdrawals from our accounts nearly to the cent. And then came the name that changed everything, Marcus Caldwell. I'd met him once, briefly. At a Christmas party hosted by Julia's firm 2 years ago, tall, well-spoken, the kind of man who complimented your shoes but watched your wife when she wasn't looking. I remembered the way he laughed too easily, the way his hand lingered too long on Julia's back. At the time, I thought he was just another polished flirt. Now his name appeared next to at least 3 of the largest transfers into Kestrel. I sat with that for a while, staring at the ledger, my throat dry. This wasn't just a lover, this was a partner, a co-conspirator. and I began to see the outlines of a plan that had nothing to do with love or lust, but everything to do with leverage. She was building an exit, one where she left with the money, the assets, the story. I was supposed to be the man too obsessed with his work to notice. The emotionally distant husband she had to escape, the liability she could quietly erase. But she had underestimated one thing: I don't break loudly, I break with precision, so I called a friend, an old classmate from law school who specialized in corporate litigation. I laid out the situation in clinical terms, no drama, just the facts. "You have more than enough," she said. "The forgery alone puts her at risk. The shell company, if proven, ties her to financial misconduct. This isn't just divorce, it's fraud." I nodded, already knowing. "I'm not ready to file yet, I just want everything in place." "You want to control the narrative," she said. "Exactly." She paused. "You're not going to confront her, are you?" "No," I said. "She doesn't deserve the clarity of confrontation." Instead, I did something that might seem strange. I invited her to dinner. I cooked, lit candles, played her favorite Bill Evans record. She came home late, offered a confused smile at the effort. But she sat, poured wine, relaxed, and I watched her. Every nod, every sip, every story about her day was another layer of deception sliding smoothly from her mouth. And the strangest part, I didn't hate her for it, I just saw her clearly. A woman who had once loved me, or at least needed me, and no longer did. A woman who didn't know how to leave without destruction, so she chose subterfuge instead. That night after she fell asleep beside me, I reached into the drawer where I'd placed the burner phone, the one I'd bought to document everything. I snapped photos of every statement, every file, every forged signature, and then I opened a new folder, labeled Exit. The days that followed were precise, almost mechanical. Every step had a purpose now. I became deliberate in everything I did, what I said, how I said it, what I touched, and what I left untouched. I moved through the house like a man folding a map only he had seen. Julia didn't notice the change, or if she did, she mistook it for detachment, withdrawal, exactly what she wanted. Let her think I was unraveling. It gave me room to move. The documents I collected, every bank statement, every email thread, every time-stamped login, were organized into a digital archive I backed up 3 times, one on an encrypted cloud, one on a hidden drive at work, and one printed and stored in a lockbox at my brother's place under the pretense of storing sentimental things. He didn't ask questions. I think he knew better than to press. A month passed like this. She was growing bolder, coming home later, leaving earlier. Her lies got lazier, less elegant. Once she mentioned a partner meeting at the firm. I casually referenced it a week later during brunch with a colleague of hers, someone I knew well enough to speak freely with. He blinked. "There hasn't been a partner meeting in 3 months. I just nodded, took another bite of my toast, let it burn slowly. I stopped asking Julia questions. That was part of the plan, make her feel like the web was holding. No resistance, no friction, let her keep spinning. And then came the opportunity I'd been waiting for. She asked if we could review the terms of our will. "You know, just in case something happens. With everything going on at work, I've been thinking about contingencies." Contingencies? The irony nearly made me laugh, but I said yes. We sat at the dining table 2 nights later. She poured wine, wore her reading glasses, always for show, and spread out the original documents like we were business partners, not spouses. That's what we had become after all. She talked about updating beneficiaries. "Just to streamline things," she said. I asked her what she thought about consolidating assets, moving more into joint ownership for simplicity. She paused visibly. It was the first crack in her composure in weeks. "I thought you liked keeping things separate," she said. "I've changed my mind," she smiled, the kind of smile someone gives when they think they've won. "All right," she said, "let's talk through it." That night, I drafted a new version of our will with my lawyer's help, one that mirrored hers in wording but not in structure. My version gave me control of the key accounts until everything was finalized, citing new legal protections based on ongoing audits. A decoy. I handed it to Julia the next evening and watched her sign it without reading past the 2nd page. She didn't even blink. She had no idea she'd just signed away the very account she'd been funneling money into. In the days that followed, I moved money quietly, cleanly, legally. By the time she noticed the discrepancy, I would be long gone. I had the documents, the proof, the motive, the timeline. All I needed now was the moment. The thing about betrayal is people always think they're the only ones playing the long game. That's their blind spot. They never imagine the person on the other side of the lie is keeping their own scorecard. They think silence is surrender, but silence is just the setup. There's a breath before the fall. A moment so quiet, so surgically still that the world seems to hold itself taut in anticipation. That's where I lived in those final days, not in fear, not in fury, but in the tension before the release. I'd timed it all, every account moved, every legal safeguard in place. My lawyer Mara had everything ready. She was sharp, unflinching, the kind of person who used silence like a scalpel. We met in a corner booth at a cafe no one would associate with either of us. She brought a manila envelope. "You're insulated now," she said, sliding it across the table. "Clean break, prepped for arbitration if she fights, but she won't." "She wo?" I asked, keeping my voice even. "She's smart, and this," she tapped the envelope, "makes her vulnerable in ways you haven't even mentioned yet." I didn't respond because I didn't need to. The plan wasn't about revenge, it was about truth. Truth, documented and sharp-edged, slipped beneath the skin like a whisper that cuts. I'd made my peace with what she was, not a monster, not a cliché, just a person who believed the world owed her a cleaner story than she was willing to earn. And I was done being the footnote in it. That Thursday I came home early. She was already there, which surprised me. Shoes kicked off near the door, half a glass of wine on the counter. She stood near the window, back turned, typing something quickly on her phone. I watched her for a beat too long. "Hey," I said casually, setting my bag down. "Everything okay?" She jumped slightly, recovered with a smile. "Yeah, just slow day, figured I'd get some reading in." She gestured to a legal pad on the kitchen table, the kind she always pretended to fill with important thoughts. I nodded. "Looks productive." We made dinner together, oddly domestic. She chopped carrots, I seared salmon. It felt like something from 3 years ago, from a version of us that used to exist. I let the silence hang comfortably between us, let her fill it with small talk and practiced laughter. She thought we were good again, that her illusions were holding, and that's what made it beautiful. When the envelope slid across the table, gently, deliberately, her hand froze halfway to her wine. "What's this?" "My resignation," I said, her brow furrowed. "From the marriage." She blinked twice. "Is this a joke?" I shook my head, calm as water. "No." She reached for the envelope slowly, as if touching it too quickly might make it explode. Her hands trembled just slightly as she opened it. Inside, a formal notice of separation, my conditions, asset breakdown, the forensic report on her transfers, copies of her messages with Caldwell, and a single line handwritten at the bottom, "I see you now clearly." For the first time in years, Julia was speechless. The power shifted without a word. No shouting. No accusations, just silence and consequence. She looked up at me, her face pale, her mouth working through a response she hadn't prepared for. There were no pieces to move, no counterplay, just a woman exposed elegantly, thoroughly, and without spectacle. "How long have you known?" she asked finally, voice low. "A while." "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I wanted to leave you with the truth, not a scene." We sat there for a moment longer, two actors on a stage long abandoned, the script torn to shreds beneath the weight of what had actually been said. "You'll regret this," she said softly, not out of anger but habit. "No," I replied, "I regret giving you the benefit of the doubt for so long." Then I stood, walked to the door, and paused. "I'm leaving the house to you," I said. "You'll need the space. The stories will take up a lot of room." She didn't reply, and I didn't look back. Outside, the air felt different. Lighter, not because I'd won, but because I was finally free of the game. I walked 3 blocks to my car, drove without music, parked in front of a small rental I'd secured 2 weeks earlier. Nothing fancy, just clean walls, a quiet street, and a window that caught the morning light. It wasn't the life I built with her, but it was mine now, uncomplicated, real. The first morning I woke in the new apartment, it was still dark outside, no curtains yet. Just the pale gray hue of dawn pressing softly through the bare windows, drawing long shadows across the floorboards. The place smelled faintly of new paint and dust. No scent of coffee, no trace of her perfume on the sheets, no echoes of tension woven into the silence. It was peaceful, not euphoric, not triumphant, just still. I got up, made black coffee in a borrowed French press, and sat by the window as the city slowly stirred to life. For the first time in months, maybe years, I wasn't holding my breath. There were no hidden texts to wonder about, no unexplained absences to rationalize, no growing chasm to measure each night with silence and restraint, just space and choice and clarity. Freedom doesn't come with fanfare, it comes with empty rooms and clean countertops. It comes with the realization that you can finally think without bracing for a lie. I didn't hear from Julia for 3 days, not a call, not a message. Just the hollow quiet left in the wake of a story collapsing under its own weight. I imagined her in that house, our house, sitting in the same kitchen where we'd once planned vacations and argued about grocery lists, surrounded now by papers she hadn't written and truths she hadn't intended to face. She would have gone through the documents again, checked the dates, traced the transfers, tried to find a gap in the armor. There wasn't one. She might have even called Marcus, tried to salvage the plan, pivot, spin, rewrite. But men like him don't stick around when the money freezes. He would have been gone before the ink dried. And me, I had no interest in watching her fall apart. That was never the point. My lawyer Mara called that Friday. She's not contesting anything, she said. I was standing in the small kitchen of my apartment holding a chipped mug filled with lukewarm coffee. Did she sign? She did. No rebuttals, no edits, just signed and returned. I nodded slowly, though she couldn't see it. Good. There was a pause, then Mara said, you know, most people, when they find out what you did, how you did it, they're going to say it was cold, that you should have confronted her, yelled, made a mess. I know. And you're okay with that? I stared out the window. The street below was wet from morning rain. A man walked his dog past a row of parked cars. The world kept turning. I didn't want a mess, I said. I wanted the truth to be undeniable, quiet, inescapable. She didn't respond for a long moment. Then, you got that, all of it. I ended the call and stood there in the silence, letting the weight of it all sink in, not just the betrayal, but the survival, the strange, steady shape of a life being rebuilt in the aftermath. That night, I opened a box I hadn't touched since moving in. Inside, photographs from before the rot set in, vacations, birthdays. A blurry picture of us laughing in a restaurant, her hand on mine, both of us unaware the future had teeth. I didn't rip them up, didn't burn them. I slid them back inside the box and taped it shut. Because those moments were real once, even if she was. Some nights I still catch myself reaching across the bed. A phantom habit, muscle memory of love, not longing, just the echo of having once been tethered to something. But each morning it fades a little more. Clean walls, quiet mornings. And no one telling me half-truths over breakfast. I didn't plan to see her again. In my mind, our story ended at that kitchen table, her hands trembling over a stack of truths she never imagined would find their way back to her. There was nothing left to say. But life, of course, rarely honors clean exits. It was 2 weeks later. A grocery store of all places. I was walking down the frozen foods aisle, searching for something mindless and quick. Dinner had become functional lately when I saw her. She was standing near the checkout alone, one hand gripping a basket that looked too heavy for her frame. She looked thinner, tired, not ruined, not unraveling, just smaller somehow. Our eyes met. For a second, neither of us moved. She was the first to look away. I almost kept walking. Almost passed by like a ghost she'd once lived with, but I didn't. I stood there for a moment longer, studying her, trying to feel something, anger, sadness, regret. There was nothing. Eventually, she walked over. Hi, she said, voice measured, careful. Julia. We stood a polite distance apart, as if the air between us still carried the weight of all the words we never spoke. You look well, she said. It wasn't a compliment, more like a surprise. You don't, I replied, not cruelly, just honestly. She blinked. Silence stretched between us like a thread pulled too tight. I didn't expect it to end like that, she admitted, eyes not quite meeting mine. I nodded. That was the point. Her jaw twitched, and for the first time I saw it, the edges of the persona starting to wear thin, the cracks beneath the polish, the unraveling no one else had seen but I had orchestrated. Was any of it real? I asked, not because I needed the answer, but because I wanted to hear her try. She swallowed. At first, maybe longer than you'd think. And after that. She looked down at the floor, then back up at me. I started to need more, she said, and I didn't know how to ask for it without breaking what we had. So you broke it anyway, I said quietly. She didn't argue. I let the silence sit for a moment, then stepped around her, but just as I passed, she asked, Do you hate me? I stopped. No, I said, I see you, that's enough. And I walked away, not with drama, not with fire, but with clarity. I didn't tell anyone about the encounter. Not Mara, not my brother, not the few friends who had started quietly drifting back into my orbit once word of the separation became public. People want a story they can rally around, a villain, a martyr, a happy ending, but this wasn't that. This was what came after the end. When the curtain's down, the house lights are up, and you're left alone in the quiet, sweeping the stage. A week later, I heard through a friend that Marcus Caldwell had distanced himself from her. That he'd cut ties, deleted accounts, scrubbed his name from the paper trail. Turns out he wasn't so clever after all. Julia was left to clean up the mess alone. The firm hadn't fired her, but they demoted her quietly. Partner track removed, cases reassigned. Her name no longer featured on the front page of their website. She still had her job, but not her standing, not her leverage. I didn't gloat, I didn't celebrate, because this wasn't her punishment. It was simply her consequence. I slept better now, not deeper, but quieter. I could close my eyes without running through scenarios, without wondering what truth I was missing, what lie I had swallowed. I stopped scanning faces in restaurants, stopped checking dates on receipts. When you've lived in suspicion long enough, freedom doesn't feel like a scream. It feels like an exhale. I wrote her a letter once. Not to send, never to send, just to write. To bleed it out on paper instead of letting it coil around my ribs night after night. Some things aren't meant to be read. They're meant to be extracted. It was short, barely a page. It started like this: Julia, I forgive you, but not because you deserve it, because I deserve to be free. I sat at the edge of my bed, pen in hand, the silence pressing in like fog. I wrote what I couldn't say the night I walked out, not because I didn't have the words, but because she wasn't ready to hear them. Still isn't, I imagine. I told her about the moment I stopped loving her, not with anger but with a kind of quiet mercy, how it wasn't the affair, not even the money. It was the morning I brought her coffee and she didn't look up from her phone. It was that small, that ordinary. Love doesn't leave in a storm, it slips out during breakfast. I wrote about the way she used to laugh when we watched bad movies, how she'd correct my grammar mid-sentence and then kiss me anyway. I told her I missed those things. Not because I wanted them back, but because it hurt to realize they'd meant more to me than they ever did to her. I wrote, you were not the love of my life. That part surprised me, seeing it written down. I used to think she was, that we'd grow old on some porch swing, arguing over whose turn it was to water the plants. That kind of myth, but the thing about betrayal is it clarifies everything. What I thought was devotion was inertia. What I thought was intimacy was routine. What I thought was love was just the version of me that needed to be needed. I folded the letter neatly, placed it in an envelope, no address, no stamp, just a sealed truth tucked inside a drawer beneath spare keys and warranties I'd long since stopped needing. Sometimes closure isn't about confrontation, it's about choosing not to speak just to prove you're right. Spring crept in like a whispered apology. The mornings grew longer, the air lighter. I started running again, small loops around the block, then longer routes through unfamiliar neighborhoods. There was something clean about the burn in my legs, something honest. I saw a couple one morning, young, probably mid-20s, arguing outside a bakery. It wasn't a big fight, something about forgotten plans or mixed signals. But I watched the man lean in, gently rest his hand on the woman's shoulder and say something that made her laugh through her frustration. And I thought that used to be me. Not with her, not anymore, but once. That softness, that repair in real time, it stays with you. It's what I'll carry forward, not the betrayal, not the end, but the quiet moments that were real. The ones that didn't need evidence to prove they happened. I haven't dated since the divorce, not because I'm afraid, because I'm not in a hurry. Healing isn't a race, it's a reckoning. I don't want to fill the silence too quickly. I want to understand it, live in it. Let it teach me what I missed while I was trying to hold someone who had already let go. The letter still sits in the drawer. I haven't opened it. I don't need to. The words served their purpose. They left my chest. They made space for something else. There's a moment in rebuilding, not a climax, not an epiphany, just a quiet shift when you realize you've stopped surviving and started living again. Mine came on an ordinary Tuesday. I was making eggs in a cast iron pan I'd found at a thrift store. Sunlight streamed through the window in broken squares, slicing across the counter. There was no soundtrack, no phone buzzing, no second pair of footsteps behind me, just the smell of pepper, the sizzle of oil, and a quiet so complete it felt like an answered prayer. That's when I noticed it. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt mine. The apartment had begun to change. Slowly, subtly, like a person learning to breathe again. The furniture was mismatched, intentionally so. The bookshelf leaned slightly to the left, a flaw I'd normally fix, but now I kind of liked it. It gave the place character. There were no couples photos, no echo of a life curated for two, but there were plants on the windowsill, records stacked near the speaker, a dented mug from a bookstore I liked, things that belonged to me. I kept the walls bare for a while, not out of reluctance, out of respect. Sometimes you have to live with the blankness before you can fill it. Work picked up again. I'd expected a slow re-entry, some fragile adjustment period, but instead I found clarity sharpened my focus. My colleagues said I seemed lighter, more direct. Less accommodating, someone joked and meant it as a compliment. I was done appeasing. In business, in life, in love. One afternoon, Mara and I had lunch. She raised her wine glass over the table and said, "You realize you're officially divorced as of this morning." I nodded. "I got the email." "You're remarkably calm," I smiled. "You don't mourn a wound, you let it scar." She studied me, curious. "No regrets." I thought about that for a moment. "I regret waiting as long as I did to see things clearly," I said, "but not the leaving, not the ending." She raised her glass again. "To endings, then?" "No," I said, clinking mine gently against hers. "To beginnings." It's strange the first time you laugh without checking to see who's watching, or the first time you walk into a bookstore and don't wonder whether your partner would be bored, or the first time you sleep in the center of the bed and it feels like home, not absence. Freedom isn't a shout, it's a door quietly closing behind you and the wind shifting ever so slightly as you step into your own life again. A few months later, I saw Julia's name pop up in my inbox. No subject line. No greeting, just 3 words: I wasn't ready. I stared at it for a while, not because it hurt, but because I finally saw how little it had to do with me. It was her confession, her unfinished sentence, her delayed truth. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Some answers arrived too late to matter. I went to the coast a few weeks after that, rented a small cabin, one of those places where the ocean does most of the talking. I hiked alone, cooked for myself, read late into the night. There was no performance, no effort to be okay for anyone else's sake. Just solitude, and the strange, full-bodied joy of it. One morning, standing barefoot on the porch with coffee in hand, I realized I no longer thought of myself as someone recovering from betrayal. I wasn't a victim, or a survivor, or a cautionary tale. I was just me, unclaimed, unburdened, undivided. There are no final pages in real life. No clear punctuation marks where the story ends and peace begins. Healing doesn't come with fanfare, it comes in pieces. Quiet moments, choices you make over and over again until they stop feeling like survival and start feeling like you. I used to think closure came when someone apologized, when the truth was dragged into the light and dissected, examined, understood, but I was wrong. Closure isn't something you wait for, it's something you give yourself. I didn't burn our wedding photos. I didn't delete her number or smash old mementos. I didn't need a ritual to mark the end. What we had, whatever it was, existed once. It shaped me, challenged me, nearly broke me, but it also handed me the blueprint for the man I became afterward. And that man didn't need to destroy the past. He just needed to stop dragging it behind him. Sometimes people ask if I'll ever trust again. The answer is yes, but not the way I did before. Not blind, not reckless. Trust now feels like a choice I give slowly, deliberately, not out of desperation for connection, but as an offering of peace. It's a gift, and I've learned not to offer it to those who treat love like leverage. I ran into Julia again, months later, different part of town. She looked thinner, sharper, still polished, still practiced, but dimmer. Like someone who hadn't yet learned the difference between control and power. We exchanged nods, no words, there was nothing left to say. The person I had loved didn't exist anymore. Maybe she never had, and yet I didn't hate her, I didn't wish her pain, I just didn't wish her anything at all. My new life doesn't look like revenge, it looks like an early morning walk, like dinner made for one and enjoyed, like laughter that doesn't check itself at the door, like friendships that ask nothing but presence, like silence that isn't laced with suspicion. It looks like dignity, like peace. There was a time I thought the only way to win was to stay and fight, to argue, to prove my worth in the face of someone else's betrayal. But I've learned the quietest act of power is leaving with nothing but your name intact. No outbursts, no threats, no ashes, just your shadow walking out of the wreckage, shoulders squared, heart bruised, but unbowed. I've started writing again, not about her, not even about me really, just stories, moments, the ache of being human. The complicated grace of starting over. And I find myself reaching for characters who don't need to be saved, who don't need the world to understand them. Just people who stand up in the aftermath, wipe the dust off their hands, and keep walking. That's the version of myself I've become, not because of the collapse, but because I refused to be buried in it. This was the end she thought would break me, but it became the beginning I didn't know I needed, because sometimes the real revenge is freedom.